Welcome to the Q&A session with me, Mark Austin, and Michael Clarke. And we're going to start with this whole idea that Moscow has claimed, without evidence, that the UK and France are planning to arm Ukraine with a nuclear bomb. Now, Number 10 has already dismissed this. What are your thoughts on this?
It's a wonderful case of vranyo, this Russian term vranyo, which is a very useful term. Vranyo is when I give you an explanation and I know you don't believe it, and actually I don't believe it either, but it's the explanation I'm giving you. And this is what the Russians are saying. They know we don't believe it. They know it's rubbish. It's more for their own population to reinforce the idea that they are fighting for something important in Ukraine rather than the vanity of President Putin and his sort of imperialistic illusions. It's not the first time. I mean, before the war began 4 years ago, the Russians claimed that the Ukrainians were playing about with nuclear technology, which was untrue. They claimed it again just after the war started, and they claimed it again in October of that year, in 2022. They said, oh, there's nuclear device. They're preparing for a dirty bomb to create a small explosion with lots of radioactivity, a dirty bomb. It was never true. And the point is, you don't have to believe me when I say it was not true. The Russian claims, such as they were investigated by the United Nations, by the IAEA, which is a very serious player, International Atomic Energy Agency. And the Russians said the same about chemical weapons. They said before the war that the Ukrainians are planning a chemical warfare facility. No evidence, wasn't true. And again, the OPCW looked at it, the Office for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons in The Hague. They looked at absolutely no evidence. UN said no evidence. So it isn't just the West that says this is rubbish. International organizations, they take these claims on. They say, what's your evidence? The Russians never produce any. They look independently and say no evidence. So I think that's where we are with this one. What's interesting is the Russians haven't said this for a couple of years, and, well, 3 years now. And they are saying it now, and I think that's for their own population more than anyone else.
Well, that's interesting. Ruth asks, is the bomb claim for domestic audiences or a pretext to something unimaginably sinister? You think it's the first, yeah?
No, you're absolutely right, Ruth. I'm sure it's for domestic audiences.
Yeah.
And as far as the West is concerned, it's vranyo. You know, you don't believe it, we don't believe it, but it's a story, it's out there. Play with it as you like.
Now, on a different issue, Mark asks, after Hungary blocked a key EU support for Ukraine yesterday, can EU states remove Hungary's membership to the EU, bearing in mind it is clearly pro-Russia? That question actually from Marcel, not Mark.
Marcel, yeah. It's a good question. I mean, and you're absolutely right. Hungary has put the blocks on two things, which the EU intended to do for this anniversary. One is they intended to announce another raft of sanctions, which Britain has done. Incidentally, this morning, Britain announced 300 more sanctions on Transneft, which is the pipeline company supplying oil pipeline transit for Russian companies, 80% of them. And Britain has sanctioned them because we can. The EU intended to back that up with their own raft of sanctions, and that's been prevented by Hungary. And this $90 billion euro loan to Ukraine is being held up by Hungary. Now, the EU always finds ways around this, and what they actually do is they isolate Hungary. Partly they do a tit for tat. They withhold funds for Hungary, which Hungary needs and Orban needs. He's coming up to an election, remember, in a couple of months' time, which he looks as if he's going to lose, or might lose. He can't fix it well enough. He's fixed every other election. He can't fix this one properly. So he needs EU funds, and the EU can withhold that. But on the broader point that Marcel makes, interestingly, as we found out during the Brexit negotiations, you can leave the EU. There is facility for that, but not to be thrown out. So the European Union has no mechanism of throwing a member out for non-compliance. But they punish non-compliance by withholding funds, by legal judgments which cause fines and so on. And Hungary's been on the wrong side of a lot of those decisions. But what you can see happening in the EU and in NATO, because remember, Hungary does exactly the same in NATO, and so does Slovakia, so does the Czech Republic in some respects. They try and do whatever Putin would want them to do to stymie what the EU and NATO is trying to do for Ukraine. And what both organizations have started to do is just work around them. They find different mechanisms. And one of the mechanisms that the EU has found is, in theory, sanctions have to be renewed every 6 months. So in theory, every 6 months, sanctions can be blocked by Hungary. And every 6 months so far, with the 19 packages that have gone through, sanctions packages up to now, they've found a way of getting the Hungarians to go along with it, just about. But ultimately, they've got to take sanctions out of that framework, and that's what they are doing, and make them a different process so that it's not 6-month renewal. It's endless sanctions until somebody says not. But they have to change the law a little bit on that. They have to change EU regulations. And if necessary, they can all do these things unilaterally. They can just do them as individual states, by and large. So the effect of Hungary and Slovakia trying to, as it were, represent Putin inside NATO and the EU is a problem. It's a nuisance. It slows things down, makes them less effective, but it doesn't stop them happening.
Now, Zelensky began the week with an interview in which he said that Putin had already started World War III. Now, we regularly get viewers asking, is this the beginning of World War III? John picks up on what Zelensky said and asked, do you believe that World War III has already begun?
I should preface my remarks by repeating what I said quite a lot of the time. I don't see World War III anywhere likely or close, in the sense that people think of World War III as destruction, the sort of thing we used to think about in the Cold War. If there's another world war, it'll destroy the world or large parts of it. I don't think we're anywhere near that whatsoever. And the two previous world wars, World War I and II, were universal wars for different reasons. And whereas we can see an awful lot of warfare around the globe at the moment, and I think that warfare will get worse, there is nothing at the moment that unites those wars. In 1914-18, 1939-45, there were other forces that united different warring forces around the world, which all had their own nuances on why they were doing what they were doing. So I don't see World War III in that sense, in the way that you pick up novels at station bookstores saying, the coming World War III. None of those things are right. I've read lots of them. They're all wrong. Not because of what they say in the Middle East, what they say about Asia, what they say about Europe is wrong, but there's never something that unites them all. So in that respect, I don't worry about World War III. Where we are in dangerous territory, and increasingly dangerous territory, is that Russia under Putin is committed to long-term belligerence. They've given up on peaceful coexistence with the West. There is this sense that Russia has got somehow to prevail in Europe and cast its influence over the rest of Europe to recover the influence that Moscow had during the Cold War, when it had its own big Russia state, Russian Federation, which included Ukraine and Georgia and the Baltic states, plus East Germany and Hungary and the Czechoslovakia as it then was, and Bulgaria. And I mean, that security boundary made Moscow feel safe. And that boundary, that was their security boundary, let's say in 1970, 1980, is now 1,000 miles nearer to Moscow than it was, 1,000 miles. And so and the Russians are pushing against that so hard that they've given up on the idea that they can ever settle with Europe as it is. So in that respect, we're in a sort of a European third war, let's call it European War III, which is long-term, it's existential, it's going to be out there for the foreseeable future, probably most of the rest of this century, one way or another. And at the moment, the Russians are pursuing it by every means up to actual violence, up to, but not over the threshold. So they're pursuing it by sabotage. There's a lot of stuff in the papers today about all of that, the battle against our pipelines, our internet cables, cyber war, the battle in social media, the battle to interfere with our elections, everything they can think of to disrupt Western Europe and to actually split the Allies, because it's our collective strength that gives us the strength that they can only dream of.
But is it strong enough, do you think, to deter Putin to allow this kind of hybrid war you're describing to tip over into
not yet
the destructive war that you began to?
Not yet, and that's what we worry about, is that as Putin is on a sort of a bit of a roller coaster, he can't get off this ride now. He went on to it inexorably in 2022. Before that, he was a kind of a playground bully, but he was a kind of calculated bully. After 2022, he just found himself on a roller coaster, and he doubles down on everything, doubles down. And it's not clear that he's in any real control of what he's doing in a strategic sense. In fact, I don't think he is at all. So are we doing enough to deter it? No. And that's what worries defence establishments, that we've got to do more to be able to push back, to say, look, we will fight you here. If you keep pushing, we will fight you. We will fight you for the Baltics. We'll fight you for Moldova if you try. And we will aid Ukraine as we think we should. It's a free state. If they want our help, we will help them. Right? If we say that, at some point, Russia will have to accept that it will be pushed back, or it'll have to fight us. Now, it's very uncomfortable. But as and when we get to that point, if we're strong enough by then then Putin or somebody after Putin might start to think a bit more pragmatically, and then we can maybe get back on terms towards some form of stabilization. But at the moment, we're kind of facing this roller coaster, which doubles down on everything. Every threat, they threaten war. Every time they threaten war, they rattle a nuclear arsenal as if somehow we're going to be very frightened by that. And, some members of the public armies, people in Germany are very worried about it. It doesn't go down particularly well in Britain. We don't worry too much about that. But other publics in Europe really are genuinely frightened by what they hear coming out of the Kremlin.
And coming out of the mouth of Vladimir Putin. Lots of questions about Putin. And Betty asks, is the war in Ukraine a personal project for Putin rather than, a war of national interest for Russia? And if Putin dies, will that alone end this war?
Yeah, Betty, well, I think you're absolutely right. This is Putin's personal project. And I mean, he's been in power in Russia since 1999. So he's into his 26th, 27th year now. And his attempt to recreate some or all of the old Russian Empire and the Soviet, let's call it the Russian Empire of Catherine the Great, plus Soviet influence of Stalin. It's some sort of combination of those two things he wants. And his desire to do that has become more and more identified with himself, and people are backing him up, like Alexander Dugin, and some of the people around him, Medvedev, the former president, prime minister. I mean, he's not part of the elite. Well, he isn't the elite. He's not really one of the key policymakers. But my goodness, he says some crazy, wild things. Karaganov, who's on the Security Council, I used to know him reasonably well. And Karaganov, backs him up with all these wild ideas. So I think this war is Putin's war, undoubtedly, which is why, as long as he's in charge, this war will not come to an end. Even if there is a ceasefire, it'll be an unstable ceasefire until it breaks out again. And that's what we're probably looking at, as unstable ceasefire followed by unstable ceasefire.
But, we just, sorry to interrupt you, but we used to talk about Putin's health quite a lot, and that people saw some sort of deterioration in his health, all sorts of things like that. And there's a lot of questions. Query I hope I've pronounced that right, asks, several months ago, Putin was apparently on his last legs. Where or why has this narrative now disappeared? Has it disappeared?
Yeah, it has from public discussion, I think. It was the wish being father to the thought. People wanted to feel that Putin was on his last legs, and they look for evidence. He's a hypochondriac. He is followed around by a group of doctors. He does have doubles who appear elsewhere for him. We can tell that from the length of their hair goes up and down within a week, in the sense that sometimes he's long-haired, and then a week later he's short-haired, and then a week later he's long-haired. And the people who greet him at different places when he goes to the front are the same people. There's a sort of bunch of actors who follow him round, which is because he's so paranoid about, and he's such a germaphobe, he won't come near to a lot of people unless he's had them checked out. So his audience tend to be the same people dressed up in different costumes. So we know all about that. But there's never been a sense that this man is, 1 or 2 years close to death, that he's got cancer of any sort. He's not. I don't know if he's healthy or he's just hypochondriac. But he's certainly hypochondriac, and he's certainly very, very worried about health issues, and he was extremely frightened during COVID. But to come back to the other question, if Putin died tomorrow, would the war end? No, it wouldn't. It would carry on, but it would carry on under a different leader, perhaps in a more pragmatic way. There might then be a way. Putin would not be replaced by a nice person. He'd be replaced by somebody a bit like him, maybe even more determined than him. But at least there'd be a new start. There would be a way of saying, there's got to be, maybe we can look at a more stable ceasefire, Vladimir or Oleg, whoever it is. Maybe we could look at something like that. But it wouldn't end the war, for sure.
And Jimmy asks, is Putin stronger or weaker now than he was, 4 years ago? I'm assuming he means politically stronger or weaker. What's your thought?
He's more determined than he was 4 years ago because he's doubled down and doubled down. I'd say he's stronger politically because as the war's gone on, his dictatorship has become greater. In Russia, there's 4 phases in political science about this sort of thing, which is quite reliable, actually. You can go from democracy, and you can be a sort of nascent democracy, an unstable democracy, and then that drifts into autocracy, and autocracy drifts into dictatorship. And dictatorship then drifts into totalitarianism. And Russia's gone through the first three phases. They've gone right through the dictatorship phase, and they're kind of into the totalitarian phase, where Putin doesn't just want to control everybody, but wants to make sure they think the way he thinks. It's a long process, or an Orwellian process of making people think the way you want them to think, and to give themselves whole, heart and soul to whatever the cause is. And Russia is now, embarked on the totalitarian phase of that four-phase thing. So he himself is stronger for that reason. Politically, domestically, morally, he feels stronger. Objectively, he's weaker in the sense that Russia is now a vassal state to China. Russia's economy is staggering, and it's not going to collapse, but it's not going to do very well. And this year will be a real test for it. Internationally, he's been brought out of the cold a little bit. He's less of a pariah, but he is still a pariah in many parts of the world. And he's weaker in the sense that there is a sense that this war will always look like a pointless war. For the losses he is taking and the gains he can make, the rest of the world is kind of shaking its head, saying, well, many in the world say, look, he'll probably succeed, but will he succeed in subduing Ukraine and reabsorbing it back into Russia? No, probably not. And that is what he started out wanting to do. So objectively, I'd say he's weaker, but domestically, in terms in Moscow, he's stronger than he was.
And he can determine what success is for Russia. He can decide.
He gets to choose
what is.
And
success.
we still don't know what his war aims are. We know what they started as, to subdue Ukraine, and then when that didn't work after the first week, we weren't clear. Was it to just hit Ukraine? Was it to grab the Donbass, protect the Russian speakers, create a state in Ukraine that was unviable by conquering the Odessa and making it landlocked? Yeah. We just don't know. No. And he's never said clearly what his war aims are. Well, we can only just guess.
It's really interesting because I was in Kyiv 4 years ago, and we'd been in Kharkiv, which is 20 miles or so from the Russian border, and then we moved to Kyiv. And when this invasion happened, it was called by the Russians a special operation in eastern Ukraine. That's what they described it as initially. And it was the Americans who said, or the American intelligence, letting it be known that they thought it'll all be over in 96 hours, days rather than weeks, and it will be the decapitation of the Ukrainian government and the installation of a puppet regime in Kyiv. So it was the Americans who were kind of describing what they thought the Russian aim was, rather than the Russians themselves.
Because American and British intelligence have been picking this up for months, and they thought they had a pretty good idea of what the Russian war plan was, which turned out it was the war plan, but it went wrong. And I remember that day, Mark, because I was in the glass box, and I was talking to you down the line from Ukraine, and you asked me something, and I said, well, this is a day of days for Kyiv, because I think this is the moment where Kyiv is going to be swamped. And Zelensky, I don't think I said it live on air, but Zelensky's probably going to be dead by the end of the week. That seemed to be the case.
This is true. And the Russian, within a few days, there was a Russian column, if you remember, on that main road into
the great armoured column.
Kyiv. And it had to stop because one of the lead vehicles, I think was a tank, broke down. And the Ukrainians had mined either side.
And it was muddy as well.
It was very muddy. And they'd mined either side of the road. And so they couldn't, there wasn't enough room.
Couldn't go forward, couldn't go back.
Couldn't go forward.
They had 3 days ammunition, 3 days food, and after 3 days they ran out of both.
They didn't move. They didn't. So
this week and a half.
This was an operation that didn't go well for the Russians. But we will never really know what Putin's plan was, I guess.
No. And that column, famously, was actually a traffic jam. It was three battle tactical groups coming together because it was so muddy, because they were going across the Pripyat marshes, and any German commander from 1941 could have told them, don't go over the Pripyat marshes in February. It's a stupid thing to do. So they found themselves in such muddy ground that they all went for the same main road. And three BTGs converged on the same road with 3 days' supplies, each of them, and got completely snarled up. And then they had to unsnarl it from the back whilst whilst the Ukrainians sort of picked away at it. And I said at the time, if this was Western air power, if Western air power was faced with that, they'd destroy the whole column from front to back. But the Ukrainians didn't have the power to do it.
And then the Russian paratroopers tried to take that base.
Hostomel.
And they were fought off
after 48 hours.
For hours. And so this didn't go well. But
competence.
But you know what the plan was. Now, what's the state of the battlefield now? People are asking. We've got the negotiations going on, but we've also got the war still happening, and it's grinding away, and it's now about meters rather than miles, it seems to be. Am I right in saying Ukraine reclaiming some territory? And Joe M., who is often asking questions, how long and at what tempo will Ukraine maintain this current reclaiming of territory?
Good question, Joe M. Because the Ukrainians have done really well since November, partly because the Russians have had communication difficulties. They broke into the Starlink system and were using it, illegally and so on. And Elon Musk has found a way, to his credit, of blocking them out of Starlink again. So they've got their local battlefield communications. But the Russians have even closed down their own Telegram channel for propaganda reasons, and that's foolish because a lot of commanders on the ground were using Telegram to talk to the people next door on the battlefront. So the Russians have suddenly had a hole in their communications. The Ukrainians have taken advantage of it. They've done really well at Kupiansk, up in the north, in Kharkiv, and they've retaken Kupiansk almost completely as a result of it, which was important that they needed to do that. And they've pushed back a little bit in Pokrovsk, a little bit, or much more rather, in Kostiantynivka, and in Lyman in the north. And the Russians, if they could take Lyman, they would try to get to Slavyansk, one of the fortress cities of the north, from the north. But I mean, even if they now take Lyman, they've still got to get past the Sersky Donets River, over the river, and into the marshy ground beyond it. And we're still in the winter. We're in the wet season now. What's it called?
It's also very cold.
Yes, it's cold, but it's warming up, and it's becoming easier. I can't remember the name of the season. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But they're moving into that season, so I think Ukrainians feel that they've consolidated a lot of their positions, and they've pushed the Russians back for more square kilometers than the Russians have taken since last summer. The problem for the Ukrainians is that they've got to retire. Some of their best units are in these attacks, and so they've got to give them some rest, and they've got to rotate them with standard units. So can the standard units consolidate the gains they've made? Big question, not clear, and a lot of it will depend as and when the Russians get their communications back on, or find some other method of establishing communications.
So Alexander asks on a similar point, how extensive is the recent Ukrainian counteroffensive? And this is, I guess, the crucial question. Do you think it could result in Russia being pushed into a ceasefire? I mean, there's no sign of that at all, is there?
No. The Russians have to be pushed back quite a long way. I mean, not huge amounts, but they'd have to lose significant bits of territory that they have fought for the last year or two. And then, as I keep saying, Putin would then be keen on ceasefire. But while there are only battlefield tactical losses, the Russians will carry on. I mean, and Putin, a ceasefire at the moment for him would be quite humiliating if it didn't go along with lots of other sweeteners that he really wants. The Rasputitsa, that's what I was trying to remember. The wet season is the Rasputitsa.
Is it?
And the Ukrainians get into that in about 2 weeks' time, when it gets very wet and very muddy, which will help the defences. It'll help Ukraine after the cold to get into the wet season. That's harder for the attackers, easier for the defenders. The Rasputitsa.
Right. Just an hour or so ago, I was talking to Anders Fogh Rasmussen, former head of NATO, Prime Minister.
Very assertive SecGen, yeah.
And I asked him what it would take now, given the state of the battlefield, for Putin to agree to a ceasefire, and he said it would take a lot more from Europe. It would take a lot more rearming. It would take a lot more. And one of the things he wanted to see was European NATO troops on the ground now in Ukraine, behind the front lines, supporting the Ukrainians. But he wanted to see at least 20,000 troops on the ground now. And I suggested, wouldn't the danger be that NATO then became drawn into the war? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it was similar to what Boris Johnson said at the weekend, that we need Western troops, British troops, he said, peaceful troops, whatever they are, on the ground. It would be a big step, and Rasmussen is very assertive about this sort of thing. We may be getting to the point where that becomes more logical in order to make a political statement that if the Russians push keep pushing us, we will fight. The issue is that we're still not ready. I say we, the Europeans, by and large, are not ready enough. And so it might be a bit premature to be that assertive at the moment.
Well, in
a year's time, 18 months' time, who knows?
And 20,000 doesn't sound that
No,
many,
it doesn't.
many
It would
to me.
be symbolic. The Russians would go berserk because they've always said no NATO troops in Ukraine, although they have no power to prevent Ukraine inviting troops in from anywhere it wants, just as the Russians have invited North Korean troops into Russia because they want their help. So there's no reason why Ukraine, if they want NATO troops, and believe me they do, wouldn't have NATO troops on their territory to backfill for them, to look after security and against sabotage in western Ukraine, releasing more of their people to go to the front. That's a logical thing to do. It would be a big step. It would be dangerous. But Anders Rasmussen, he does take that sort of line, and I think he takes it rather more thoughtfully than Boris Johnson does, and he has thought it through, but it's a big step.
Well, he has thought it. Well, he says he's thought it through, and the point he was making was that Russia is weak now, and that now was the time to call Putin's bluff. That was his
I take
point.
that absolutely, because going back to what I said before, I mean, Putin's on a kind of a roller coaster of forward-leaning aggression, constant aggression, constant doubling down, and this up to the threshold warfare, all this hybrid stuff with the pipelines and all the rest of the sabotage in Europe, a lot of secret operations going on, which are being uncovered even this week. All these properties that the Russians are buying up close to facilities, particularly in the Scandinavian countries, that look as if they're bent on sabotage or Spetsnaz operations, Spetsnaz behind the enemy lines. All of that is building up. And so at some point, we've got to push back. And we've got to push back knowing that the Russians will escalate. At the point we push back, they'll scream blue murder and escalate. So we have to be ready for whatever that escalation step is. So it's all very dangerous stuff. But if we don't do that, then things will just continue to deteriorate in terms of our ability to defend ourselves against this constant war.
Now, finally, we should talk about how this war ends. You've watched it now very closely for 4 years, Michael, and we've spoken many times during that. And quite often we've tried to, or I've been asking you what you think about when this war will end. Claire asks, is this the year the war ends? And how do you actually see it ending?
Well, war is an unpredictable business, so any predictions are likely to be undermined quite quickly. But as things stand, looking at the trends now, I can't see the battlefield changing so much during this year, because drone technology has had the effect of freezing the front line more or less in a zone of something between 10 and 40 kilometres, all the way across the 600-mile front, 1,000-kilometre front. And that's probably not going to change in the short term until somebody finds a real answer to the drone problem, and nobody has so far. So let's assume that continues throughout the year. Front lines don't change that much. Ukraine is determined to fight on even if the United States turns away completely. And that will be very hard for them without US intelligence support and without the ability for Europe to buy weapons from the US and give them to Ukraine. If that all stopped, life would be much tougher. But they seem determined to carry on. Putin is determined to carry on. So I don't think that the battlefield, either on air, ground or sea, is likely to change that much. What may change is the strategic context, and that depends on what happens in Washington, Moscow, Beijing, Berlin and Brussels. And maybe London, maybe. But it's the outside players who will dictate the strategic objectives that the war then represents for the coming year. If I had to guess, pure guess, we'll be sitting here this time next year looking at a 5th anniversary when things might then begin to be strategically different because of changes in the United States and the political setup there, strains in the Russian economy, changes in NATO, maybe a different view in Beijing. They're getting a bit fed up with supporting Putin in the way that they're supporting him. I don't think it's going to happen this year, maybe next year.
Well, that's a depressing way,
I'm afraid so, yeah.
to end. Michael, thank you very much indeed. And there are talks going on, we think, in Geneva on Thursday, a resumption of the talks that have been going on between Ukraine and the Russians and the Americans involved in that. But there's not really much hope. And as Michael suggested, most wars end in compromise, and Vladimir Putin's tendency is to leave compromise to the very, very last moment. So, as Michael says, this war goes on. Thank you very much for watching, and Michael will be back with another Q&A very soon.